Gotcha. Yeah, that's a really interesting point to make. And I think it's a good idea to look at things the other way around, right? We're looking at poll quality right now and how polls are influenced. But I think it's also very important to consider uh, how do polls influence voters, right?
Yeah, yeah,
For
definitely.
example, yeah, we could have like a bandwagon effect where people just try to vote for the winning party because who wants to be on the losing team. But this effect, this bandwagon effect, has actually been confirmed, sort of, in some research papers. There's this
Really.
2014 paper by Rothschild and Malhotra,
Hmm.
which they ran an experiment on 234 respondents. And what they did is they asked all of these participants to name their likelihood of voting in favor of a particular question, and they had several questions. And then they gave them a random number and said, this is a percent of people who support this issue as well. Now, what's the likelihood that you would vote in the issue's favor? And they actually did observe a significant bandwagon effect. And we can talk about the numbers in a second, but let's get to the argument first. And
Hmm.
in particular, this bandwagon effect is prominent when the issue doesn't fall neatly on party lines, right?
Hmm.
So this would be, for example, in the case of an independent voter, because by definition, an independent voter is more likely to vote based on the candidate as opposed to the party line itself. Um, and it's quite interesting when you look at the block of independent voters because they actually take up a larger percentage than either the percentage of Republicans or Democrats. We're looking at 30% each for the Republicans and the Democrats um, across the general population. And the independents, they take the rest of the population. It's 40% actually. So the bandwagon effect should be stronger with independents. And um, of course, we've seen all the polls predict Biden to win. For example, NBC Biden plus 10, Fox News Biden plus 8, CNN
Hmm.
Biden plus
Hmm.
10. So this should, according to the study, influence independents particularly to vote for Biden.
So
Um,
that's, I mean, that doesn't really make sense to me, right? If you have an independent, then they're specifically trying to not fit into party lines. They're kind of they're proposing their own thing, basically, that it
sure.
does not really fit neatly within each of the party lines. And so I would think that they would be less likely to be on the bandwagon, right? Because they're more likely to kind of be independent in the direct sense of the word, just going along with their own idea and not just going along with somebody else.
Right, right. And this definitely depends on how you look at the idea of an independent. Um, you could have like a true independent who might vote for the Green Party or whatever, but then you can have independents who are leaning right or left. And there's been a famous book published about how there actually is no independent voter and everyone just leans one way or another. We can't get too in depth into that because of time constraints, but
Definitely.
I think I think in general, for example, the country is becoming more polarized. So we can see that even with independents who consider themselves not affiliated with a political party, they probably will align one way or another. And I think that's where the bandwagon effect might take place. But there's another point of consideration
Hmm.
because there's a second study from 2005 about how certain things that candidates do can influence voter turnout. And they noticed that candidate advertisements influence turnout among independents in particular, mostly because these just kind of cast a net into the deep blue sea, um, and thus they're as likely to have an effect on independents as everyone else. But if you notice that Biden is outspending Trump on ads by a 2-to-1 margin in all the key six swing states, and you couple this with the bandwagon effect, then that creates a pretty good argument that there's more independents who are going to come out and vote for Biden.
Interesting. So I wonder, I don't know how much will that play in the actual election because I think a lot of what numbers are. So I think it's good. It's the time we go into the numbers and actually
Yeah.
see what is the effect of this bandwagon kind of phenomenon, how large is it, and what's the probability that it will sway voters to one side or the other.
Yeah, it's a good idea because Again, if we consider the block of independent voters, it is a significant block.
Mhm.
40%. It's bigger than any other block. But let's go back to the first study, right? Um, and so what they did is they actually ran the ranges of hypothetical percentages in favor of one specific issue from 20 to 80%, right? And what they found was that um, an 80%, in comparison to the 20% figure, you would see an increase of approximately 8% in the likelihood of an individual voter to support a particular issue if the fictional support was raised to 80%.
Okay,
That
so
comes
basically, if you
that
raise the, if people think that other people like around them are voting for the candidate, then they themselves are more likely to support that candidate.
mhm. And we're looking at, like, for example, the figure they gave on average was again 8%, corresponding to 20 to 80% increase, an increase from 20 to 80% of the hypothetical support. So
Okay, yeah.
so they actually were able to take this figure and make it so that the coefficient acted linearly, and so you can see that, for example, 20% increase would correspond to 2.7% more likelihood that the individual voter is going to vote in favor. And I think that's pretty significant, especially when you consider how close this election is.
So I mean, this is an interesting point, but I wonder if this is practical and all, right? Because you said that even to get an 8% vote change, you would need to increase particular opinion on an issue from 20% to 80%, and so that is
Yep.
a 60% increase. And if we look at something like the state level, I don't think that is likely in any insignificant amount of time, which is like less than a month, less than a year. It's just not going to happen.
Yeah, that is a good point. But if we look at the polls again, we've got anywhere from 8 to 10% on the upper range of big polls, Fox, CNN. These are polls that people pay attention to because of the big name. And if we just take the flat rate, right, we're we're seeing 10% increase in support for Joe Biden, which should correspond to what's 2.7 divided by 2. You
That
would
is
get that.
1.35, yeah.
Yeah, you get 1.35% increase uh, in likelihood for independent to vote in favor of Biden. And that's the stuff that tips people over the edge. So and 1.5%, it sounds small, but then again, Trump didn't beat Hillary by that much, especially in some key swing states.
Definitely like Michigan last year.
Mhm.
It was
Yeah,
very
absolutely.
close.
And if you look at how Biden is pouring money into these swing states and outspending Trump 2 to 1 on advertisements, which again affect independents, then all that should come out, according to the papers, um, a higher likelihood of independents voting for Biden.
Okay, that's a good point, and I think because well, I feel like independents are not distributed uh, equally across America as per your definition. So, what do you say are some of the more independent, quote unquote, independent heavy states? So, what are some of the states where this kind of campaigning can have the most effect, per your opinion?
Well, by definition, that should be in the swing states.
Okay, so we're looking at Florida, we're looking at Michigan, we're looking at Pennsylvania, right?
Hmm. And I think the reason, so there's something to consider is that most people vote along party lines. Actually, there was an NBC poll um, that concluded that 8% of, I believe, Democrats and 11% of Republicans are voting across party lines. So we're talking 90% retention rate, and that's pretty significant. So if you want to have a big turnout, then you want to look at the independents, which is why these studies are kind of significant.
That's a good point, and I think independents. Well, I would argue that those actually are the ones who decide the elections because you have
Hmm.
some electorate, you have some people who are always going to be on one side of the issue. They're a devout Republican, they're a devout Democrat, and they haven't changed their opinion for say 20 years. But then you have a lot of people kind of there in the middle, and they adapt to the circumstances. And so I think those people moving around is what actually causes all of these like contested well, not contested elections, but very hotly controversial elections just because they become so close because one person, there's just a little that is needed to take them over the edge to the other side.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. And that's what the significance of these studies is. That 1.5%, that could mean Trump or Biden.
Yeah. So I think that's a pretty powerful study. One thing that I do find kind of problematic is that they only tested 234 people, right?
Yeah.
So how significant of an effect is that when you expanded, say, millions of voters?
Uh-huh. I mean, that's a question that we're going to have to wait and see. Um, they did mention that they found their sample to be rather randomly distributed, so that's good. But then again, it was an online poll, and it is more modern. This is a 2014 article, so a lot of the statistical biases in prone to online polling are going to be less prominent, but still, we're going to see. That's all you
So
can say.
yeah, I think it's also a good point that you bring up. It's made in 2014, and that's before the 2016 election, which I feel like that is when we really started seeing the effects of how polarized the country is. So they kind of, in a sense, they predicted this to happen, right? Because
Yeah,
they predicted the bandwagon effect. We kind of have these two sides in America, and they're irreconcilable.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so do you have anything else to add in terms of this particular study or how it affects our predictions for this upcoming election, November 3rd?
No, not really. Um, yeah, that's pretty much all of it. It's kind of hard to consider these studies in a broader context, especially when they're just one study, and it might not be that hard to go around and find another study and just point out and be like, hey, this is a study that has a contrasting result. I think it is important to note, however, that these studies have been cited multiple times, I believe, in triple digits, so that's pretty
Mm-hmm.
significant.